When the Devil Went Down to Georgia, one of my favorite songs by Charlie Daniels. And I often say when I explain to people my practice of law, I say, I'm Johnny with a fiddle when the devil came down to Georgia, as a way of making a point of skill and talent and capability and being underestimated. The other aspects of when the devil went down to Georgia, and for those that don't know the song, I highly recommend listening to Charlie Daniels' version thereof. The devil went down to Georgia in this Trump indictment. What do I mean by that? In the New York case, the election is not at issue. In the Florida case, federal case, the election is not at issue. In the D.C. federal case, the election is partially at issue. But in the Georgia case, the election is the issue. And what's most significant is that Georgia had the best of developed evidence of any state in the country for Trump's grounds to challenge the election. This is why I've included a highlighted copy of the Georgia election contest and what was documented and detailed in that election contest, that 90% of it reflects the work that I did when I was in Georgia. And the indictment pretends that Georgia election contest doesn't exist. For those that don't know, the only election contest that Trump ever filed was in Georgia. The Fulton County courthouse was supposed to assign a superior judge to have an evidentiary hearing within 10 days. Instead, they never did. And the Court of Appeals and Georgia Supreme Court ran and hid rather than do anything about it. So it was never tested. And by the time it was scheduled to be heard after January 6th, at which point it was moot. And with the events of January 6th were used to encourage Trump to not pursue the case after the election, after January 6th. So it was dismissed. But if you look at the details of the complaint, some people have asked, I was talking to some members of Congress and others today about this, because many have forgot about this election contest because it got lost in the news about Dominion and machines and Sidney Powell and Krakens and all the rest. That's how the Fulton County Courthouse got away with refusing to hear it. But the details is they fit into 3 buckets of illegal votes. And what's useful about the Georgia election contest is it cites the international election standards, cites the good cases from Georgia, and reminds everybody the legal standard. And it's based almost entirely on my theoretical structure to the case, which was you start with, who does the Constitution say determines how an election is done? Well, it says the legislature. Okay, what did the legislature say constituted a constitutionally qualified ballot? That depends on who voted, that depends on how they voted, and depends on how the votes were counted and canvassed. The canvassing part is when they separate the ballot. Part of the canvassing part is when they separate the ballots from the ballot application envelopes and to be able to match them up and to check the ballot envelope against the voter registration card signature. Well, the rules in Georgia had certain rules about who could vote for the presidency. You couldn't be underage. You had to be at least 18 before the election. You couldn't vote. You could only vote if you were registered at the address you lived at. It had to be your habitation. You couldn't have moved within 30 days, either out of state or inside the state between counties. You have to vote in the state you were registered at 30 days before the election. You have to be alive at the time you vote. You can't be a felon still serving your sentence. Those are 5 of the key disqualifications. Of course, you also have to be a citizen of the United States, citizen of the state of Georgia, and you can't have voted in another state in the presidential election or be registered to vote in another state in the presidential election. The overwhelming detail, looking at post office records, looking at mail address records, looking at death certificates, getting live testimony from people who knew of people who had died, who were reported as having voted. All of that was critical to whether only the constitutionally qualified voted. And what you see and what you found in Georgia is over 100,000 ballots were cast by people who were not constitutionally qualified to vote in the presidential election. And again, you don't have to prove that that voter would have voted. All you have to show is there were more illegal votes than the margin of victory. Well, the margin of victory was around 12,000 votes. That's more than 8 times the number just in that first category of the constitutionally unqualified, for which the remedy was ordering a new election for the presidency, which is what the requested remedy was. The second problem is the method by which the ballots counted. In order for your ballot to count, you needed to confirm your identification, and if you did this by mail-in, you had to do it 2 things. You had to be the one to request the ballot within a certain time frame, and secondly, you had to sign it in a way that the signature matched the signature on your voter registration card. If you didn't, then your ballot didn't count. In Georgia, the Secretary of State mailed out massively ballots to anybody and everybody, which was illegal under the law in Georgia and thus unconstitutional. All of those ballots were by themselves constitutionally questionable to be counted or included. That was compounded by the fact that he often sent multiple ballots to the same people, including sending them to dead people. He did this, Brad Ratberger, the Secretary of State, did this in a secret deal cut with the Democratic Party right before the presidential election, because he hated being called racist. Then the other aspect is you got to make sure the signatures actually match. The signatures didn't match. Historically, there's at least 3% of signatures that are rejected at a minimum just in absentee ballot applications. In the petition signature requirement, when they oppose the same requirement that's supposed to be the case for ballot applications and mail-in ballots, that number jumps dramatically to around 30%. But even if you took the low end of 3%, that is far more ballots. 1.3 million ballots came in. And that means if you had just a normal 3% rejection rate, that would have been 50,000 ballots, more than 4 times the number of the margin of victory. My estimate was that at least over 120,000 ballots signatures didn't match, based on comparable studies out of Arizona. And that also, in just the second category, is double the number of ballots needed to throw out the election and the margin of victory. But that isn't all. The third aspect is how the votes were canvassed and counted. In order for a vote to legally matter, to be included in the certification, the ballot needs to have been one that comes from a constitutionally conforming canvassing and counting of the ballot. What's that all about? Well, that's all about party observers and public transparency. We don't want to incentivize people to count ballots in secret. We don't want people to canvass ballots in secret. We want the public and party observers and candidate participants to be able to make sure that they are actually following the process in the canvassing process, confirm the identification of the voter, and then confirm the signatures match on any mail-in ballot application, and then only count the ballots when the public can see it and when there's party observers present. Both were routinely, repeatedly, and flagrantly violated in Georgia to the tune of hundreds of thousands of ballots, including the famous fake story about a leak pipe that had to shut down. And for those that don't know, what happened is Fulton County decided not to have their ballots counted at the local precinct. Instead, they decided to have it concentrated in one location. Perfect place to facilitate this kind of voter fraud. Second, they didn't like all the public participation and party observation. So what did they do? They said there'd been a leak and that this big leak was causing an issue and they were just going to have to shut down all the ballot counting and everybody was going to have to go home and then come back at 8 a.m. in the morning. And what happened, as is famously seen on one of the videos, as soon as the party observers were gone, as soon as the public was no longer present, as soon as everybody thought the voting had stopped, they dragged out those big buckets of baskets of votes and started counting again. When magically Trump started losing gain and ground, and Biden made up ground in a way that was almost inexplicable statistically. Indeed, they said there were fewer ballots yet to be counted than ballots that were counted for Biden. That's how nuts it was. But that is backed up by hundreds of pages of affidavits from dozens of witnesses and documented detailed study. That's why them indicting Trump in Georgia, that puts the election itself at center issue in a case that will be broadcast by video, may be the example of when the devil went down to Georgia, and in this case, the election contest and Trump is Johnny with a fiddle.